So when I was in my teens, in the process of developing a life model, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And she had 3 or 4 years to live. And one of the benefits of being with somebody who's got a finite lifetime is you talk about things that you would not normally talk about. And we had a really interesting series of discussions over those 3 or 4 years. And I learned an awful lot. The downside is you watch somebody that you love die a miserable, awful death. So that came before I'd had established a life model. I didn't believe in a God. I didn't believe necessarily in life after that. I didn't understand all of that stuff. And I was left, after her death, with the conclusion that, you know, it's not as it's being described by the organized religions today. It doesn't make sense to me. You know, you watch on television back in just after the Vietnam War, all the genocide and all of the ugliness of the world and the suffering and so forth. And then they just talk about God being, you know, so good and universal and makes the universe and all that. And it just was inconsistent. It wasn't believable. So I started looking at science for some of the solutions. And this is all going on sort of in the background. This was not ever a focus. I was never a student. I was an observer of this. And over a period of the next 35 years, I've woken up probably 100, 150, 200 times between 2 and 4 a.m. And you wake up with these, I'm sure you guys have had this. If you go to bed with a question, every once in a while you wake up sort of a bolt of epiphany. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I keep waking up. The only way to go back to sleep is to get up and start writing this stuff down. I started writing down in a journal. And it just sort of kept coming over the years. Never talked to anybody about it, including my wife, who wondered why I was getting out of bed. It was, you know, I made it sound like it was work-related. And in 2008, October 6th of 2008, I still have the journal. It flashed in, and the whole thing worked for me. Now, the model's only important to you if it's believable. And the whole thing worked. I understood how the subatomic particles worked. I understood gravity. The whole thing fit. All of the different questions were locked together with the addition of this one variable and a couple of assumptions. And the assumptions are far less aggressive than the sort of the faith assumption by religion. You have to have faith. At least to me they were. And I spent the next 3 years, I was afraid to talk to anybody about this because my goal was to have a model. I had one. It made sense. I understood what happened after death. And I didn't want anybody to invalidate it. If something comes up that hits it too hard, you got to start over and rebuild it. And so I stopped talking to people about it, or didn't talk to people about it. And then I got more comfortable, and things like dark energy would come out, and a lot of information on particle physics and antiparticles, and all of that would come. You'd see them in the journals, you talk to people about them, and they all had to sort of work, and they all did work. And in 2 years ago, I met an interesting woman who were having some drinks, and we're talking about this stuff. She's very interested in God and spirituality. And she said, I talked to her about a piece, she said, you got to write it down. I said, you know, not interested. Well, she introduced me to a chemical physicist. This is like a long story, not so long. This woman who's a PhD physicist and I have spent the last 2 years doing research into the standard model and really digging back into what's going on and then comparing and contrasting it with this new model, with a fix. And as we got into it, it got more and more clear to us that it worked really well. It all fit. And a lot of the questions that I had were answered, and we'll talk about that today. I'm going to just go back to this because I've not done this in a long time. I don't have notes, so I'm going to make sure I don't skip over anything that's important. So when I started looking at science, I rejected religion as the solution, or as it was presented as most of the solution for my model. And I began to look at the scientific models, and I found that they were just as confusing and as unbelievable as some of the religious models. And it was things like the Big Bang. You know, the entire universe exploding from a pea-sized object in several nanoseconds and exploding out, everything going farther and farther away from each other. There were things like gravity. You know, you've got the most important constant in all of math, in all of scientific mathematics is the gravitational attraction. It's two objects attracted, and they didn't have a reasonable answer to why gravity was there. It just was there. You know, the strong force in nuclear physics. And then, you know, the big one for me was what powers the atom. You know, what Einstein didn't know when he came up with this theory of relativity is that the atom is doing work all the time. They think there's electrons going around at the speed of light, wave-like patterns and so forth. They're oscillating, it's putting on electromagnetic force, yet there's no power source for the atom. The lifetime is 10 to the 23rd years, which is a lot of zeros. And they didn't have a power source. Well, Einstein didn't know it was moving back when he wasn't even sure he was an autonomist when he did his work. So we've learned a lot that didn't have answers in the standard model. And that made me really question it. And that sort of launched me onto looking into it by myself.